Sure. Hi. Yeah, thanks for having us here. My name's Tony Rose. I'm here today. We're representing DATA, the Digital Asset Trade Association. We're a new group that's getting formed to be an industry trade association to lobby on behalf of the blockchain distributed ledger ecosystem, to lawmakers, primarily focused around the U.S., but also, with charter to be coordinated with international bodies as well. We most recently have been helping in Wyoming, so if you've followed what's been going on there, it was the Wyoming Blockchain Coalition leading the efforts, but also the Digital Asset Trade Association group that has been forming the data, we call it. I kind of lent a hand and put boots on the ground and did a lot of the lobbying efforts. So you can reach out to me later if you'd like to find out more about data and what we're doing.
Yes, so my name is Corey Harris. I'm the Community Growth Manager for Dispatch. Dispatch is a smart contract platform. It allows DApp developers to create data-centric smart contracts. I've been following the blockchain industry since about 2009 when the first purchase was happened. Someone bought some pieces for like 10,000 Bitcoin. Wish I was that person. I jumped back into the industry around October of last year and started an organization called Blockchain with the goal of increasing the level of understanding in the space. And through my work there, met the good people at Dispatch and decided to join the team where I help create and lead the strategy for what I would call creating trust in the community, which is one of the infrastructure issues wrong with the distributed technology space, right? So my whole goal with Dispatch is to figure out how can we create more trust in the industry and make it more usable to the average person.
Cool. I'm Alex Voto. I work with an organization called ConsenSys. So we're now, I think, about 1,200 people or so. And our primary focus is as a venture production studio. So we like to operate primarily on the Ethereum blockchain, but open to basically the entire blockchain ecosystem, trying to figure out how we can create developer tools that make it easier for folks to use these distributed systems, create some of what we call spokes, which are projects that kind of demonstrate the value of these systems actually in practice. So building kind of ventures, businesses or projects that allow people to actually harness that potential and do something peer-to-peer. We do education. We do basically have like a venture side, which actually helps invest in projects in the distributed ecosystem if they're not actually already a part of our group. And so I helped open up the West Coast space here in San Francisco with my friend Ron Patiro, and had been kind of growing our presence here and working with the community to help source folks to work with us, folks to collaborate with, and just kind of get the sense of the best of San Francisco and bring that into kind of our fold and work with folks here. So really excited to be here. Thank you all for coming out. So I'm kind of like soft moderating here. So I'll be doing dual role here. But I like part of this community is getting roped in somehow. Everyone has their own kind of origin story of their buddy who kind of got into this stuff. So I'm curious, how did you quote fall down the rabbit hole as everyone likes to say it here in the space? What was your kind of first interaction with this, and sort of also maybe a little bit about where you came from prior and how this kind of interjected into your life?
Sure. Well, I've been in the Silicon Valley for about 20 years and have always loved emerging technology, starting with e-commerce and internet radio, and special place in my heart for live streamers. I set up one of the first streaming radios on the internet, but how I got into blockchain was through the lens of payments. So after a few stints in running my own businesses, decided to take a break from that and went to work for a company called Vantiv. And their recently acquisition of WorldPay has made them one of the largest payment processors in the world, certainly in the US. So I was in charge of digital wallets and emerging technology for Vantiv for a few years and deployed Apple Pay and the pays, we like to call them, and payments. But I was able to see just how dysfunctional payments are in so-called, developed markets, and just kept hearing about blockchain sort of through various podcasts. I was trying to become a payments expert through this, adventure in payments, and I just kept hearing whispers of blockchain this, and so after a while, I was like, okay, let me look into this. So I started looking into it, and just the more I learned, I realized it was going to be very fundamentally important in rewiring the economic fabric of the world, is kind of how I like to think about it. So after sort of wrapping up the Apple Pay deployments, I just went pretty much full time. So the last 2 years, I've been a full time blockchain enthusiast, let's say. Been fortunate to enter the space early last year, and as I was doing my sort of technical due diligence and figuring out how to move Ethereum or Bitcoin to Binance, and like, wow, everything I touch turns to gold, right? Like, if you weren't making money in crypto last year, like, you probably weren't in crypto. So I don't know. I was able to put aside a little bit of money, and so this year I've pretty much been focusing on more being like a crypto lobbyist. Just since I have a lot of just background and respect and love for entrepreneurism and emerging tech, I saw a lot of my friends, including Nick over there, and a lot of entrepreneurs in this space in the Bay Area in particular, product people that were just running into like massive roadblocks and headaches because of fears of regulation. And so I didn't have like the next great idea in my head, so I thought, well, maybe I can serve the community by being involved in activism. So that's sort of how I found myself with data and getting involved in trade associations and speaking to lawmakers and such.
Yeah, so when I first heard about Bitcoin, I thought it was a joke. I was in college. I majored in economics. So I was actually just learning and exposed to how powerful the IMF was, the U.S. The Federal Reserve. And I'm like, how can a few lines of code actually replace those two organizations? I was like, this is impossible. The 2014 boom happened. Saw some friends lose money. And I pretty much told them they would, because everybody was coming at the top of the hype cycle. And Warren Buffett has a great quote where he says, sell into greed, buy into fear, right? But I guess prior to falling and understanding blockchain, I was a serial entrepreneur, started a couple websites. In college, I started a website called Blinkness that helped college students find the easiest professor. I built a textbook website that was like Priceline for books. I'm sure everybody here probably went to college or knows somebody who went to college, and books are just really expensive. All right, so I had already had that technology bug in me. And then to kind of speed up to last year, again, I saw the boom go back up, and then I fell down a rabbit hole and started just reading white paper after white paper, read Bitcoin, Ethereum, IOTA, just went down the list and just did a lot of reading. Read so much that for a week I couldn't do anything. I was like brain dead, right? So for me, I'm really fascinated with distributed technology because I see it as a new form of economic thought. And just going back to what I learned in college, with classical economics, they say if you give rich and wealthy people more money, they will invest more. But when you look at the proliferation of how these cryptocurrencies have gained their value, it started from more of a microeconomic standpoint. The average person started buying them a lot more, and then the wealthy people came in and kind of blew the market up to where it is, or to where it was. So for me, I just see it more as a new economic theory at play. And it's very fascinating to me that now we can create currencies or tools where you can misalign people who've traditionally been misaligned based on where they stand on how they make a profit or whatever drives them, right? So
I actually, speaking of community, which is the focus of all this, there is one community that I had intersected at the very periphery was like the Occupy movement. And one of my buddies, so I was introduced to this by into the blockchain space. I too was in economics, I was like studying like, this is how markets work, and you should just shut up and kind of follow the rules here. This is, these are the levers that you have to tweak, and that's pretty much it. And this was around the time when, when I was learning about economics was when the entire economy was collapsing. That's, if you can pin my age, my first introduction to economics was the collapse of everything we knew. So I was like, well, this can't all be true. That there's got to be some way of actually hacking this to be a little bit better. And my buddy came to me just kind of like feverishly, who, we had taken a college course together. He's like, oh my God, you have to read this paper. This is insane. This is insane. And he had been given this paper from an Occupy organizer, and it was the Bitcoin white paper, and basically saying like, this is going to change everything. Like, this is going to be the new future money and everything. And so like everyone, I think in this space, you have like a first introduction and then a dismissal period. I feel like I should be one of the people drawing the Gartner charts. It's like the introduction to Bitcoin, the lull, and then the, oh my God, wait, I should have paid attention back then kind of thing. So he said, this is a new kind of like leverage point where we can decide to like exit the economy and build our own. And so went through the lull. I had actually joined a think tank in Palo Alto called the Institute for the Future, which was focused on kind of letting people know how technology, social trends, business shifts would actually affect the long-term future. So helping people think creatively 10 to whatever years out. And, blockchain technology kept coming up as like, oh, this is going to change healthcare. This is going to change all this other stuff. So my job in the community was helping people to understand sort of like what was happening, first of all. So I got back into this, started listening to podcasts and everything. So I was really grateful for the community to actually help me catch up. But then it was to actually share this. And largely this was with large enterprises. So this was helping folks like, like Walmart, IBM, P&G, these groups sort of figure out what was happening and help them imagine not just like, okay, how do we take advantage of Bitcoin or something, but really like, if we had the ability to use this to do something dramatically different, what would that mean for us? And through that work, since we had a really nice space in Palo Alto, I actually started organizing the Ethereum Silicon Valley meetup, which is how I got introduced to Ron, my friend who ultimately became my coworker, who brought me into ConsenSys to help start a San Francisco office. So we, got things kicking here. We finally just got our new office, which you all are invited to if you ever want to do meetups there. But I've continued my work of helping people sort of strategize and think about what are the full range of possibilities, and also who do you have to interact with to actually get stuff done. So I had a bunch of people had come to me and sort of said like, hey, we're thinking about this particular thing. And that trusted advisor role and being a part of their community, even if we're not actually bidding on the work, is really important. So I've been a part of that enterprise group and sort of helping people envision what's possible and what's happening. But so just thinking about like that broad term for community, like in all of our different kind of roles, like what does what does community mean to us? Like what does it actually mean to interact? Like I'm sure like community kind of means meetups maybe, but like each of us has a different goal, different incentives and stuff like that, and different ways that we actually interact with people to get stuff done. Can you speak a little bit about community? And maybe you want to start?
Yeah, so I would actually define community and basically just set it equal to trust. Again, you look at most of the projects that are out, the industry as a whole, we just don't do a good job of being trustful, right? And a part of the strategy that we're creating at Dispatch is all about how do we make ourselves approachable and make sure people really understand what our underlying goal is with the protocol, right? It's a lot more than having developers build on top of us, but we also are socially conscious. We want to make sure that our token ownership is fully distributed and not, I would call it decentralized, but centralized, right? When you look at a lot of the tokens, they're held by a few people. And there's a lot of tactical stuff that you can obviously do, like marketing automation. But with emerging technologies like we're in, it's all about being approachable, right? So, doing meetups, but also educating the participants of your meetups, or making sure they actually fully understand the technology and not just doing a meetup around which token should I buy next, right? That part doesn't really create a community, which is when you look at like right now, right, we're in a bear market, right? So now I think all of you all are like really into the space because you're still here and it's not cool. I have friends who ask me like, hey, what happened to your portfolio? It's a joke now, right? So I think with projects, what they should do is focus on the stakeholders who are really in the industry versus just trying to create hype. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think there's actually, I think, a good story to be told about the connection between community and regulations, and the connection between decentralized distributed networks and network effect, and the dynamics of how those things play together. It's, yeah, I want a bear market, but why? A big part of the reason is that it's hard to get tokens in people's hands. So, not only, so sure, part of the reason is that there was a bunch of hype, a lot of projects got funded, there were scams, and this was a period where the market gets kind of like learn, right? Do your own research, pump and dumps. And was grandma going online to Binance and losing her coins? No, right? It was mostly techies that were like super excited about stuff. And, the regulatory overreach has put a massive damper on the innovation potential in the space. So kind of the way I look at it, and I talked to Will about this sort of leading up to this panel. He asked me a question, what do you think is the biggest regulatory problem? And I'm just speaking from my own perspective here. I'm not speaking from data's perspective, because when we speak to regulatory bodies, there's a whole different strategy involved. But when I look at the accredited investor rules and the way that ICOs have been forced to go to the private pre-sale model, there was this massive wave of experimentation coming along, which was trying to find ways to get massive distribution of tokens in people's hands so that various governance models, various incentive models could be experimented with and tried out. And when everyone started getting afraid of the SEC saying, oh, everything's a security, even if you're just trying to try out a new governance model, like the innovation like really screeched to a halt because you're afraid to innovate. So I think that from a community perspective, crypto and blockchain and tokens are all about community, because you can't have a network that's decentralized without community. There's no, like, they don't go without each other, right? It's like water and wet.
What does it look like on a, not a dated, I mean, just whenever you engage with folks in this sphere, like how does community feel to you in the like legal and regulatory space? Like what does it mean to engage those folks or hear what they're thinking?
My experience has been primarily really being the sort of, the voice of the entrepreneur in Wyoming. So I never participated in any sort of lawmaking or lobbying before, and I gotta tell you, that was an awesome experience. It was a lot of fun. But Wyoming is a very special place, right? They were the first place to give the women the right to vote. They created the LLC. They have a 20-day legislative session. So I was able to observe and participate in, over a 20-day period, 5 laws getting passed, which compared to, I've been to Sacramento to talk to lawmakers once with the Blockchain Advocacy Coalition, and it's just a very different situation in California than Wyoming, right? I mean, that's just the way it is. But it's good that Wyoming has this sort of sandbox that you can sell a utility token to anyone in Wyoming. They happen to have the least populous state in the country, but still anyone can buy a utility token from you there legally. So go at it. Go experiment. Try to be the next like big network government consensus model, right? Like good luck actually getting any results. But I kind of look at things like EOS and how they, a lot of controversy on that project, but they were really innovating on like, how can we test and try out a new way to get tokens in as many people's hands as possible? Like, period. Like, that was the goal. Like, that was their stated goal. And they really thread the needle in terms of, block.1, not, making any promises to deliver anything of value. And, you could read their white paper and like make fun of them for that, but that was legally. Like, they were doing that to avoid liability. And you look at how EOS like distributed the token to probably more people than any other ICO, and in this wave of last year. You see how EOS stood up a network with complete volunteers. It was messy, but it was completely decentralized, and I applaud what they did, but no one else can try what they did right now, right? Like, who can try that without being seriously afoul of like regulations? So I think that, from a community perspective, regulation is really just hampering our ability to create community and get tokens in other people's hands, right? So what can you do if you sell tokens to your private pre-sale? Accredited investors only. I'm not an accredited investor. Like I don't want to divulge that because it's a little embarrassing, but it's true. Like I'm an entrepreneur. I've had up years and down years, and that's just the way it is. And I wasn't able to buy tokens from very good friends of mine's projects last year, and it's stupid, right? It's stupid. So then you get your tokens in the hands of accredited investors, and you're trying to build a network with network effect and community. First of all, those tokens will be locked up for a year, and then what? After a year, they can only be sold to other accredited investors. So people like Polymath and T0 come out with those like security tokens will be the next big thing. But where's the community? It's like only people that are in that small group of accredited investors can play. And like you're not going to revolutionize finance or supply finance or supply chains or payments or any of this stuff if you can't actually get to community. So that's kind of why I find myself more involved in like the lobbying and the lawmaking side, because I feel like that's really where like the barrier is to this tech reaching its potential. Yeah. But then you have other jurisdictions around the world that are standing up friendly places to go play. And Silicon Valley and San Francisco is, if I didn't have kids and I didn't love surfing so much in Pacifica, I would probably I'm out of here, right? Like screw this. I'm going to Malta. I'm going to Singapore. I'm going to any number of jurisdictions that will actually let me innovate.
Yeah. You mentioned, actually related to regulation and law, like the purpose is they're trying to understand the stuff to keep people safe, right? And you mentioned the role of trust and how like building that out, like education's also a part of that, right? Is helping, education for lawmakers, also education for the actual people doing it. Can you say a little bit about, I know like with blockchain, you've been doing some education, helping people onboard to this stuff. What are the challenges with kind of educating folks and getting them to feel comfortable with it?
So 2 answers. With the regulation, I agree with you. Like I went through a week or 2 getting certain token incentives cut because they would make us more of a security and we want to stay a utility, right? So now I have a different variable to think about when I'm trying to grow the community, right? Just hitting the pillow like, man, I can't do this incentive because it could get us in trouble. But with blockchain, the biggest problem in the industry is that people really care about things that are on top of mind, right? So if I go up to some random person and say I work in blockchain, they're like, what's that? And then if I tell them Bitcoin, they're like, oh yeah, I know what that is, all right? So our strategy, particularly with blockchain networks, and I use it with Dispatch as well, is I look at what are the top issues in the industry. So for example, the coin check hack, I think it was 400 NIM that was stolen. So all of a sudden people were very scared about losing their crypto, and we did a meetup around Crypto Fraud 101, and that was actually our biggest meetup. And then afterwards we did a meetup around cold storage, and the interesting thing I learned there is that people are scared about losing their crypto, but they don't really care about protecting it, which is weird, right? So yeah, so that's one of the strategies that I've actually seen help is just look at Twitter, look at whatever top stories happen in tech or in the world, and actually create content around that to kind of drop.
So that's almost like viral topics for the crypto space, huh?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
I was laughing, me and my co-founder, about. I was like, this is crazy. Like, I was like, yeah, they're going to show up to this cold storage, and like less than half people showed up.
Yeah, that's scary.
Hold on, like maybe your title is wrong, right? Like, crypto fraud is a lot more interesting. Like cold storage, like who knows what that is? Right? Like what is cold storage?
Like
I barely know.
I used a picture of an iceberg, though.
Don't let your crypto get stolen there. How to secure? I don't.
Yeah.
Not your private keys. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, I also think. We've really struggled. So I had this experience with the think tank I worked at. Is every single day it would be a new client from some completely random industry that was trying to say like, why should I care? And so I was constantly context switching and saying like, oh, if it was an agricultural company, it'd be like, oh, well, it's kind of like, how you, pay for it. So I'd have to kind of switch this sort of thing, and it's meeting people where they're at, which I think also kind of raises the question of like, who are the community leaders we're actually trying to work with to educate folks, because it can't just always be the technologists working directly with this stuff. I think there's a huge role for building relationships with existing institutions and with existing communities, and trying to figure out like how do we create a simple common language around this stuff that people can then take and make work for their own kind of context.
Well, I mean, that's definitely the charter of data, right? And other industry organizations. So the Blockchain Advocacy Coalition, based out of San Francisco, the industry associations do speak to each other, and that's a big part of the challenge, right? Like, how do you communicate in a way that it creates a common understanding, a common set of language that people understand? Cold storage, right? Like, we probably all get it, but to someone that's not in crypto, they're like, is that like where I put my hard drive? Like, what? You know what you're talking about? So, but that's a big part of why organizations like Data exist, is to help the community sort of come together and create that unified voice to speak to lawmakers about what's important to us. And Data had a kickoff breakfast earlier this year where we brought the CIO of the CFTC and the SEC to a breakfast. And I sort of asked them that question pointedly, like, who are you hearing from in the community about things that matter to us? And they both said that they didn't really have a whole lot of actual community voices speaking to them. So there's certainly a need for the community to invest in like having that voice to participate in creating that narrative.
Yeah, and added that, I would say if you want to build a strong community focused on the persona type or the key stakeholders who are actually going to build and make your community stronger versus just going after retail investors. I think that's the issue that I've seen a lot with most of these projects. Is that they only try to appease to the retail investor, but they're not going after or creating incentive models to where you keep people coming back, right? They're just saying, hey, if you share my post, we'll give you 5 of our token, right? Like create incentives that say, hey, if you continue to use our wallet for transactions, we'll give you X or whatever, right? And then it goes back to regulation, because there are certain incentives you don't want to do from a regulatory standpoint, right? So it's like the dilemma that I actually found myself falling into is that this is a great way to keep people and make them long-term on our platform, but wow, this makes Social Security, so we can't do that, maybe later, so.
Well, so I wonder, education's one big barrier, and I mean, like, if you think about the community that you want to engage, like chances are for a lot of this stuff, you're looking at, large institutions, you're looking at developers, but I wonder, so there are probably a number of other blockers other than just education, but who are we not engaging in the blockchain community that we ought to be engaging more?
I would definitely say emerging markets. I can't remember who I was talking to, but usually what happens, you have a blockchain project that starts here in Silicon Valley. They're all friends, buy their token or invest in it, and then they're like, "We're trying to change the world.
Friends.
we're trying to change the world, and we want to power micropayments, but only people in San Francisco are using their token, right?" And that goes back to creating a community of trust, right? Like you're saying you want to do one thing, but your strategy and your implementation of it is actually completely off. It's like you're literally just creating a decentralized, centralized power vacuum for yourself. It ends with your token going up in value, right? So, yeah.
It's interesting you bring up emerging markets, because I mean, there's a whole nother just tangent we go down with community around payment, right? Crypto and emerging markets. But what does that really mean?
Go do it.
To me, what it means is payments, right? Like, what is crypto's first use case if not transfer of value, right? System of transfer of value. So, like, sort of one of the things I sort of fall back on from my experience is I was involved in helping set up the first SMS inter-carrier networks here in the U.S. And this was like early 2000s. Everyone said, "Oh, well, Americans will never use SMS because we prefer to make phone calls." And the only reason Europeans use SMS is because it costs a lot of money to make a phone call from, let's just say, from London to Paris. So they would rather text because it's cheaper. That narrative was completely false. It was wrong. And the reason why was because if you were on Verizon, or back then Singular, or any of the other hundreds of telcos, SMS didn't work. Right? Like, I couldn't send you a text message from my carrier to your carrier. It just didn't work. And once we actually sewed together all the networks with interoperability, it went asymptotic, right? It went completely, through the roof. So this idea of interoperability is really critical. And specifically with emerging markets, where I think we all can kind of see there's an opportunity to leapfrog payment networks, and we all sort of appreciate the efficiency and the value that we get in our day-to-day lives of being able to make electronic payments over the Visa network, even though that's, under the cover, pretty ugly how that works, it works, right? Like, we don't have any real pain around making a payment for a cup of coffee. Right? There's no reason for us to use Bitcoin or Bitcoin Cash for a cup of coffee, right? But in an emerging market where they're dealing with cash, they don't have banks, they don't have digital payment systems, there is a real need, and there could be a potential, leapfrog effect there. But I think it really comes back down to interoperability, and right now, in most emerging markets, the way I understand it, is you're going to have to use your cell phone. Your cell phone's going to be the means of the payment mechanism, and mobile money systems, for the most part, are siloed, right? So it's very similar in my mind to how SMS was. You have M-Pesa is sort of like the gold standard of like mobile money, but they've been doing it for 10 years. They need a break. Like, can we come up with a better example of success in mobile money? It's ridiculous. And the reason is that telcos, and I spent 10 years working with telcos, so these guys are anemic to innovation, and they feel they need to compete with each other on things where interoperability would just actually make everyone's business more. So just sort of like wrap it up, I think in an emerging market, the real opportunity there is to kind of figure out how do you get the telcos and the banking systems to come together and create an interoperable digital payment system that doesn't use credit card rails. And then that would do it.
Sort of switching. Oh, yeah. Switch. Actually, do you want to?
Yeah, but also too, I've seen projects that say they want to help democratize finance, but at the core issue with emerging markets is that they don't fully own their natural resources, right? So that's like the real underlying issue that I actually see. And if a cryptocurrency comes out that actually helps these emerging economies, communities really own their natural resources, then we will see a reason for them to use the cryptocurrency. Because if I'm in India or in the middle of Africa, it's no point in me having a bank account.
Well,
because I can't afford it, But if
can I get that for me? So you say like own the real resource. So to me, that sort of like begs the question of like tokenizing assets, right? So like, what do you mean by like how do you bridge the gap? Like connect the dots. Like how do you go from these people in this country need to own their resources to cryptocurrency as a solution?
So basically, instead of when you look at the supply chain now, right, the manufacturer is the lowest one that's paid, right? But it's actually the most important aspect of that supply chain, right? If there's no growers for coffee, no one drinks coffee, right? So they should be compensated more than what they are getting now, right? Like you look at Walmart as an example, they basically go to a smaller supplier and say, hey, this is the price we want to pay. And then Walmart's essentially the retailer and the wholesaler.
Coffee's a good example. So we talked about this earlier, right?
Yeah.
With coffee, you have growers, and growers sort of aggregate themselves into cooperatives. So at the point of the cooperative, they still own those beans. Those beans belong to them, right? So if they had more transparency in the supply chain, more ability to negotiate upstream, and better understand the value of their product as it went along the supply chain, they could then maybe perhaps demand more negotiation power. Is that?
Yeah. I also want to actually, so slight change of topic, but going back to what you mentioned about if only there was a way to get telcos and banks cooperating on standards for payment. So one of the activities that I'm engaged in at ConsenSys is actually working with the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, which was created about a year ago to help, or actually a little bit more than a year ago, to help organizations have a forum for discussing how to use Ethereum effectively, to come up with common standards for actually how to use create interoperable dApps and interoperable kind of client software, and just generally help bring Ethereum into the enterprise context in a way where it's kind of vetted by their community. And so I've got to witness the sort of kind of amazing levels of conversation there, and also the grinding difficulty of getting these kind of large institutions onto this stuff. So I was there when these working groups were first getting started. People were sort of, I think one aspect of community is also like getting people to share their best selves and getting them to be open and feel comfortable with sharing their assets and capabilities and best information. So, we had these moments where folks just were like, yeah, I like identity. Yeah, I also like identity. And that's kind of the end of the call, basically. These very short moments where you have 10 massive banks or something on the call, and it's these that you can't imagine the value of just asking a simple question like, why don't you share with us something that you're comfortable with about what you've done in the last year regarding blockchain stuff? And then they're like, oh, well, we did a pilot, and it's like, tell us more, So this is where the standards work actually comes out. It's like, oh, you guys had an approach, share it. Would you be willing to share your architecture? We haven't been used to asking folks, at least in the enterprise context, asking folks for their best practices and sharing them, and realizing that ultimately there's a ton of duplication of efforts, and what you're doing is not really IP bearing. Like, surprise, what you've done with Ethereum to get it started is not that special. And what really matters is sharing those standards. So one of the big things is recently, actually 2 weeks ago, I was in LA working with the telecom special interest group of the EEA, trying to help them figure out what are the major use cases for telecoms to actually discuss. And there were actually folks from GSMA in the room, kind of observing the conversation and trying to figure out how is this stuff going to actually affect the standards that we create globally for mobile devices in the future. So having those folks in the room, having them be humble, and just asking them, how do you want to play together? There was actually, a moment where we started to realize, we were working on an IoT spec, and just actually, this is not that hard. We're just talking about ways that we could each do our own thing, but maybe there's one little opportunity for an API. And it quickly got to the point of saying, okay, that's not really the big IP thing. We should just play together. We should both build on this network and actually start experimenting and trying that out. So that heavy lifting of getting organizations to trust each other and actually open up a interesting test bed for them to play together, I think is really crucial. And in that spec discussion, when I was first getting involved in the EEA through ConsenSys, my primary thing was I want to build Ethereum dApps and I want to build a San Francisco community. But I was asked, do you want to do this standards work? And I was like, I don't know, I guess. It's like, well, you've worked with enterprises, right? Yeah. And so I got involved in it. Didn't realize that standards are a massive way that communities can come together to actually make stuff happen where you're not, it improves interoperability, improves the quality of things, makes things much more easily digestible by traditional institutions because it has a stamp of approval. And so we're all working toward a common client spec for how an enterprise-grade Ethereum client should be coded, right? It must have these properties. It should have these properties. It may have these. And by industry, maybe you have to add some features like HIPAA-compliant sort of encryption algorithms and schemes for. GDPR. How do you actually manage that? So if you want to be enterprise-grade in this context, how do you do it? And there was in this conversation, which happened again 2 weeks ago in New York, there is this question of do we want to track public Ethereum? Do we want to actually model this and take all the improvements that are being done on Ethereum and actually make what we make part of or directly tracking this stuff? And that question, the fact that was asked in a community forum of people trying to kind of figure things out, that could have dramatic impact. I mean, in this room were hundreds of people from top organizations that run our lives. So these are the kind of conversations we want more participation in, not just from more organizations, but for those people to have a plug-in from the developer communities in the blockchain space, for them to have actual visions and needs from social communities that are outside of the folks developing, but who are actually going to be using this stuff. I think there's a big role in organizations being more open to hearing more perspectives as they try to figure out what's the future of this stuff. So yeah, I mean, it's and I guess has anyone else experienced that interaction between the enterprise community and the anarchist kind of public community and any of the tension that has existed there? I mean, you're dealing with kind of the storytelling around this, right? You're helping regulators understand how much of this is permissionless innovation versus how much of this is,
Yeah, I think one of the most recent examples of that is, I don't know if any of you follow Caitlin Long, and her, I guess, ringing the alarm bells about the BACT announcement. So, I mean, this is certainly the Bitcoin maximalists versus the banking system
Could
story.
you maybe just share a little bit for those
Yeah.
who haven't seen
Yeah, I'll
that?
give a little background. Assuming Bitcoin maximalism is something you guys are familiar with ish. BACT is BAAKT. They're the way I understand what they do is they provide IT infrastructure to exchanges like the New York Stock Exchange. And they've recently made this announcement. It was very cryptic, but they included McDonald's and Starbucks with their big announcement about opening up some Bitcoin derivatives on some exchange technology that they were going to release at some point, right? So from the perspective of, like, I sort of heard this story through the perspective of Caitlin and who else was it? So just some other podcast I listened to. I'm trying to remember his name. Chase. Anyway, I'll remember in a second. But they're sort of raising the point, and this sort of thing I was hearing from them. First, I was like, oh, the Bitcoin maximalists are all pissed off again, and then I started reading about it. I'm like, okay, they're kind of making a big point, which is this idea that the way Wall Street firms and the banking system works today is, this idea of fractional reserve banking, and that sort of flies sort of in opposition to this idea of Bitcoin with its fixed monetary supply. So this is like, kind of to your point, like an example that I can think of recently where sort of the traditional finance system is butting heads with the ethos of Bitcoin, and a really interesting dialogue this happened in the last several weeks.
What do you think is what are some of the main issues there, and like how could those be resolved, or kind of what does that mean? What does that tension mean long term?
I mean, so like there's like two things I'll say. I'll say the main point, then I'll say my conspiracy theory. so I think the main point that they're making is that you can't do fractional reserve types of lending based upon crypto assets, because the way that bank firms work today is they sort of take assets, whether that be mortgages or actual fiat or whatever, and they sort of lend against those, and then other firms will lend against the thing they borrowed, and so you sort of this domino effect of, they call it rehypothecation, which is a word I'm still trying to understand what it really means. Yeah, it's very fancy, but fractional reserve, we can kind of get what that is. But it's sort of fractional reserve domino effect, which apparently is a lot more widespread than I kind of realized based upon the way they're talking about it. Oh, Trace Mayer. Trace Mayer was the guy that was doing this podcast. So if you guys never listen to Trace Mayer, be careful, because if you do, you'll buy more Bitcoin. Like, he's just like one of those guys where you're like, oh my God, I have to buy more. It's really fun to listen to. But
Make sure you say
yeah, was that?
this isn't investment advice.
This is not investment advice. Yeah, exactly. So that was sort of the main point, was that if firms, and I was trying to warn the firms, like, hey, like, you guys need to make sure you understand this stuff before you go and sort of take custodianship of it. Even if you figure out how to take custodianship of it, then you try to lend out against that could introduce risk you're not really fully aware of how it works. And the other point they raised was that, say that a fork happens, and I actually had a big back and forth with them about this, because they were trying to raise the point, like, hey, if the network forks, you're going to be holding this coin or this that you don't have custody of. And I was like, well, they do. They have the coin on both forks. And so there was actually a lot of back and forth. I'm like, you're kind of making a big deal out of nothing, because if the coin forks, you still have the private key to both chains. And then we went back and forth a bit more, and what they were really trying to say was that if the chain forks into something, the example is privacy preserving. Say that some Wall Street bank has a whole bunch of coin, this chain now forks, and most of the community, like the community point, goes, oh, we like this chain because it's privacy preserving, but that happens to be illegal in that jurisdiction. Now this firm is holding a bunch of coins that, like, they can't touch. So that's another risk they were trying to raise to the firms. But so my conspiracy theory on this, and why they included McDonald's and Starbucks in their announcement, was, who does more payments in the world than Starbucks and McDonald's? And if they're trying to get into this, like, we want to take custody of as much coin as we can possibly get our hands on, and then do funky financialization services on top of that, what better way to get a hold of private keys than just like do payments in Bitcoin or whatever for McDonald's and Starbucks? Like, they would just start to become accrue over a long term, more and more and more private coins. And then what's actually sitting inside of your wallet, your Starbucks wallet or your McDonald's wallet, isn't actually coin. Maybe it's an IOU for a coin, or maybe it's a loyalty point that's backed by a coin or something like that. So the conspiracy I have was like, yeah, this is really a clever way for them to get a hold of the 21 million Bitcoins.
So it's interesting. I mean, what we're also on the frontier of, you mentioned forking and kind of the difficulty of actually controlling that from an institutional perspective. Like, I wonder, what we're starting to witness, what it's like to actually manage something on the scale of a global payment system with decentralized governance, where folks are free to sort of fork off, or they're, no pun intended, or you can, and that there's a tremendous amount of like conversation that's happening on GitHub. It's permissionless, and no one can really, even the foundation has things that are outside of its or I'm speaking from the world that I've been involved in, like the Ethereum Foundation. They really don't have the final say on something. It's not Vitalik deciding everything. So what are the sorts of ways that you think decentralized governance might grow, and sort of what might that mean for the future of how we manage systems? Like, what are we heading into now that we're learning how to do this?
Yeah, so there was a podcast that I listened to, Epicenter. I can't think of her name, but she's
I love Epicenter.
legal expert.
Yeah.
And
no, she was saying that the coder should have a fiduciary duty.
yeah, I'm not 100%, and I guess that chair doesn't agree either. I'm not 100% opposed to that idea, but I'm also not 100% against it. I think what she's getting at is that when you look at a lot of these Ethereum smart contracts, and then they'll say, hey, we're fully decentralized. Part of the reason I don't like using the word decentralized anymore, I'd rather use distributed. So decentralized in application means that I don't want to pay taxes and I don't want government intervention, right? So that's why I don't like to use it in application. It just doesn't make sense when you look at the way these projects just throw it around. Distributed would be a more of a
That's a very interesting definition of decentralized, by the way.
That's awesome. I mean, that's how I seen it. But kind of lost my point. Yeah.
Governance across people that are geographically and
yeah, I think there just needs to be more accountability from the entire industry. Thank you. It's just very low, right? So you look at these smart contracts, and they're completely different from the marketing material, from what they're talking about this blockchain or DApp is supposed to do, right? So how do you get engineers to build contracts that are actually in the real embodiment of what they're saying they're supposed to do? I don't know the answer to that question, but yeah.
Yeah, I would just say I 100% disagree. To put the onus on coders of decentralized systems to be responsible for your decision to use that coin for whatever purpose you think it might work for, I think it'll just put a really chilling effect on innovation in this space. Clearly, we're like the early days of this technology. Bitcoin had a bug last week where miners could mint new coins, right? Like if anyone in this room thinks that Bitcoin is impervious just because it's lasted 10 years without a major fault, like you just don't understand software.
There was a DDoS attack that happened to it like almost 8 years ago, but it was forked off and it was taken care of.
Well, that's the governance question too. Like when do you fork out these mistakes?
Yeah.
But to say that the solution, per the episode of Epicenter we're listening to, should be shifted to the developers. The developers should be fiduciaries of these systems. They're, basically Ethereum and Bitcoin have been primarily volunteer driven for much of their history. To turn around and say, well, anyone else that wants to go and build these systems or experiment in these systems is now going to take on liability legally by releasing software and letting people use it. I don't know. I don't necessarily agree with that. But just to sort of answer your question a bit on governance, we're also in the extremely early days of decentralized governance. And decentralization isn't just, I don't want to pay taxes. It truly has to do with how is decision making happening, right? What do we have now? We have two examples. We have proof of work and we have proof of stake, and that's it. And there's one or two, or maybe 4 or 5 actual live networks that are doing proof of stake. We know nothing about governance, decentralized governance, in the ways in which we will know in 5 years. And that's what I mean by we're in the early days, right? In how governance and decentralized systems can work effectively.
There's a historical link that's kind of interesting. Is that group I mentioned I worked at, the think tank, was the Institute for the Future, and one of our founders was Paul Barron, who is the person who actually wrote that centralized, decentralized, distributed graph. So he on the pencil sketch and everything like that people have on their T-shirts. That was one of our founders. So he was deeply interested in the future, and I think there's some accounts that are not in textbooks from folks who knew him from back then, who mentioned that they were asked him, were you really trying to create like a nuclear-proof communications network? Like, was that what your intention with that? He's like, no, I just wanted to see institutions get burned up and imagine a new way to do things. So that was actually that was a radical, and I think many people picked up on that when they imagined kind of the breadth of what could happen if we built these kinds of communication networks. We got the internet. We got something that totally changed humankind. And I think when I looked at, many of us noodled this on the entire 5 years that I was there, and continuing on, kind of trying to decipher what the intention and the future of this centralized, decentralized, distributed model could be. There's no, I think, real clear thing. It was built for a purpose, which is communication networks. It's up for us to interpret. I think all of us are operating with different assumptions about it, but I always viewed it as a spectrum, right? Like, I think many of us in the community who came from this idea that Bitcoin was going to be our future, our thing to build, that was going to allow for kind of a permissionless way for us to all sort of develop our own futures and have our own freedom and stuff, that distribution was where we were trying to get to, and decentralization is like the active fight against the groups that are trying to prevent us from doing that. I think, but what I've come to realize from working with organizations, large institutions on this, is like, those groups and all the resources that they command, like, they are a part of this. That there's got to be a way to actually bring these folks in. I think part of the legal and regulatory battle is trying to figure out, what are the means that we can actually create safe, effective highways for folks to actually get involved, to feel comfortable, to have the freedom to do things while also being responsible to parties whenever possible. It's hard to do that with, and where the buck stops is actually quite a difficult discussion on that. But, I can imagine that we will get good enough with this governance stuff where we can have distributed networks and properly maintain them. Wherever there's actually a local opportunity to create a network of cooperative ownership or what have you, that there's a right-sized governance model, a right-sized economy custom built for that situation. And through these kinds of standards that we can actually interoperate across all of us and make it work. Not make it work for everyone for a big utopia, but do the best we can. I think
Sounds very utopian.
I know, it's very, yeah. But when in the back of my mind, some folks come into this and they're like, how do we build a token? How do we do a launch? I'm like, I'm viewing this utopia. That was the long-term vision I was really looking at, is this is all a means to an end. It's pretty boring software, honestly. Like, you're talking about a new way to do a database. The potential, though, is how do we all learn to trust each other so that we can all cooperate? And if we can do it both at the local and global scale, I think that'd be pretty sweet. So I want to take this opportunity. You got your hand up. You knew. You might have felt this. I want to hear from all of you and get some new voices in the room. So can we do a little Q&A?
Hi, how's it going?
Hello. Going
So
well.
I just had a quick question about, just from like a community building perspective, for developers building dApps, in terms of onboarding people to be managing a private key, using, taking custody of their token within your application. Could you touch on any types of approaches that you've, seen or thought of around helping onboard people where you're managing the key for them until they take custody, and kind of the risk tolerance based on application, for how important it is for them to actually manage their own private key for that application? So any insight on that would be appreciated.
I haven't worked directly on that. I just mentioned an app that I've actually used to hold crypto. It's called Exodus. And Exodus, it sits on your computer, and your private key is encrypted, so it's never revealed to you. And it's protected by, I think, like a 13 or 15 word phrase that you create. That's like a good one. In regards to, I guess, onboarding dApp developers, I think it's very important to develop a physical presence in the different crypto hubs around the world, right? So having people teach Solidity classes on how to write protocols on your platform, which is one of the things that I'm actually leading at Dispatch. I think it's very important to actually have, not just an ad campaign for build on top of us, but you got to have someone there walking them through it. so that they can answer questions and stuff like that. Again, it goes down to building trust and them feeling like they can really reach out and touch you and talk to you.
I'll mention that one community that I appreciate has finally gotten started in the Bay Area, and I know has started elsewhere, is just a community of designers in the blockchain space who are dealing with the UX issues of like, how do you save people from themselves, and how do you help people understand that they are now taking ownership of their own lives? You know, like, you are the owner now of your data. It's not someone who's going to make promises to you and then sort of take it from there. So I can speak from a couple of I mean, in the interest of talking about something I know, not for plugging, we have two identity solutions actually at ConsenSys, one of which is MetaMask and one of which is Uport, both of which are platforms that a lot of people base their decentralized applications on when they need an identity or token holding layer. And you know, MetaMask has like, huge, read this thing. They try to kind of make it consolidated and brief, and it like, you have a means of sort of double checking that people actually are reading and understanding these things. We've worked on on the legal side with ways that we can actually help people understand the implications of actually storing these digital representations of value, and actually how you can run tests on whether or not people actually comprehend these concepts as a precondition of them being involved in your system. So that's something from like the kind of social side, is actually doing like, testing for folks of their understanding and comprehension. On the Uport side, actually there's your identity is sort of stored in a proxy contract of sorts, and you generate a way, on your mobile device of actually interacting with that contract. But if you were to lose your key, they're trying to enable you to actually do kind of social recovery to regain access in the system. So it's not a one-for-one that if you lose your device or you lose your private key, that's the end, right? I think that we need to be kind of realistic with these kind of fail-safes or ways of actually helping people regain access, and perhaps, like with multi-sig or some other sort of means, like create a way for them to regain these things by even trusting traditional institutions. I think we've been kind of, the goal is to get to a place where everyone's able to manage their own data, manage their own assets and everything like that, but we should be real. Some people actually have communities that they trust, folks that they can actually work with that have their best intentions, and we can incorporate that option, but while always maintaining the ability for someone to take direct control. I think those kinds of usability patterns are really promising.
Yeah, I think it really boils down to account recovery when you think about it. Pretty much every wallet out there does the passphrase, sort of the various flavors of please write this down. But when you think about emerging markets like we were talking about, and people taking custody of digital assets, account recovery is really important. So institutions, right, like multi-sig recovery, where you trust your telco with one part of the recovery and maybe another third party. And then I think from a protocol level, EOS, again, I think what they've done with the way they've structured their accounts is super interesting. They allow you to set a partner that can recover your account for you. They have each account has 2 layers. So I would definitely take a look at what EOS is doing. And again, just back to reiterate your point, I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity to develop, account recovery around digital asset custodianship.
Thanks.
On the topic of EOS, what's your personal views on which way new projects should go? Build on the Ethereum network or build your DApp on EOS?
Okay. I think I get it.
Ethereum versus EOS.
No, hell no. No, I've been actually a pretty big, I think a lot of people have a misconception that like ConsenSys is the Ethereum house. Like we use it because it's awesome. Like it's a great tool. It's done a lot. We've built a lot of the infrastructure, so we understand it quite well, but we're not, like the goal is to usher in more like ownership of everything we do, enable peer-to-peer transactions, and we have a responsibility to help people that we work with to achieve that vision. And maximalism is not a good approach to doing that. Like I said, we've not hit many roadblocks with Ethereum. We've done quite well at solving people's problems with it, but we're looking toward a future where blockchains are interoperable. We're looking toward a future where there are APIs to actually integrate with legacy systems, just to be realistic. So I think the real goal is not like, which system do I build on? It's really, how well do you understand the people that you're serving? Have you really incorporated their needs and their trust models and their fears into the system? Have you integrated usability? Research into that sort of thing, and then make the best decision. If it's Fabric, if it's Ethereum, and not to mention also your developers, right? Like your developers might come from a background where they're working on Java primarily, and so we, for example, just created an Ethereum. We've been kind of working on enabling systems that allow people meet people where they're at, and I know eWASM, for example, is on the Ethereum roadmap, which would help people actually compile the code from whatever they write. So there's technical implications of this, there's social implications of this, and really it's just the best tool for the job.
I would say there's starting to become other options besides just those two. I've heard it, I'm trying to remember the name of it, but there's an Ethereum compliant with Solidity network that just launched fairly recently that has, I'm not quite sure how they did it, but from what I've read is like a scalable Ethereum, more so than the Ethereum is now. Just to be blunt with my opinion, from what I've understood about the Ethereum mainnet roadmap, I think they're going to face tremendous challenges moving to proof of stake and sharding and this stuff, and the timelines just don't seem to align with where the rest of other projects are moving to much more quickly. So just, again, like to your point, it depends on the use cases specifically, but from a scaling perspective, I would do your research. Scaling? Yeah, sure. So I mean, on Ethereum in particular, their stated goal is to move to proof of stake, right? So I think there's big challenges with the incentives to move big miners, to a proof of stake model, right? They've invested in all these ASICs, all this hardware, and they're making good money. Their businesses are built around the proof of stake incentive structures, and they have all this hardware, right? So what do they do with that once Ethereum decides to fork and go to proof of stake model? So I just think that is going to be a hard road, where you have new networks that are now stood up that are operating at scale, and sure, they're going through growing pains, but is EOS going to grow to be more stable and more trusted sooner than Ethereum is able to move to proof of stake? I don't know your bets. Yeah, I mean, neither am I. I mean, I have a pretty strong opinion. I think ETH is in big trouble from their mainnet perspective, but that's just the way I would go.
I would definitely say build it on top of Solidity, because most of your smart contract platforms do allow for you to build on Solidity. They support the EVM. Does Stellar support Solidity? No. Yeah, I know Hyperledger, Cordona's supposed to. Yeah, public chain, or just period.
There's a brand new
Yeah. But I would say you can't really go wrong by making it on writing your smart contracts in Solidity, because you can move it to Neo, you can move it to Dispatch. I mean, there's a lot of smart contract platforms that allow you to that support Solidity. But also look at if you're building a dApp, think of the incentive models you want to create, because you want to create your dApp on a protocol that has the least transaction fees, because that's going to limit the type of incentives you can make. Because a lot of dApp white papers that I read, their biggest expense is their gas costs. Like one paper I read, they're like it can go up to $1 million a month. So that's a lot of things you want to consider, and then also what is the ideology of the people who created that particular chain, right? So with Ethereum, their main goal was to prove that you can do an ICO. EOS, just and from what I've seen the application, but with EOS, it's about creating decentralized autonomous organizations, right? So having a full understanding of what the goal of that blockchain is very important to understanding whether you should build on it or not, because that falls in line with the use case you're trying to create.
I'm sorry, could I? Many of them are written in Solidity. So I'll just mention it's important for folks who are really interested in this stuff, looking at the limits of this technology. First off, you should question if the way that you're designing applications is really really necessitates that. We've been able at ConsenSys to achieve quite a bit given the current standards of the public net. And then the other thing to consider is also that many of these, like I said, it's the right tool for the job. There are a ton of ways to actually use what is considered Ethereum that is not actually on the mainnet with permission and private networks like Quorum, JP Morgan's Quorum. A lot of folks are actually developing applications on that, and proof of authority, which allows you to actually develop systems in a different trust model that aren't bounded by the same needs for proof of work. So you can actually do kind of voting and like raft consensus models and stuff like that. So the same kinds of developer tools that are available on the Ethereum mainnet are actually available to you in these permission networks. There's a whole breadth of experimentation. Even today, without proof of stake, which is a very, I mean, it's an important step towards scalability, but it's not as tied to scalability as something like state channels or Plasma, both of which have working implementations, right? Or I'll say that state channels have examples of implementations. Relay networks have examples of implementations which are kind of closely related. And Plasma is this huge ambitious concept that a lot of folks are working on. So I would say that scalability is not necessarily just rooted in the mainnet chain consensus algorithm, although that's an important part, and we're seeing sharding actually as another main concept. I think there's a lot of exploration, and folks just need to actually dig in and actually help us build this stuff. It's not that moving to a different consensus mechanism is the only way of actually achieving scalability. You can do a lot kind of off-chain and actually settle things on there.
Hey, I'm Nick from Decent. Corey, first of all, I want to thank you for writing a simple, easy to understand guide to token economics on Medium. I'm waiting for the fourth part. I don't know when we're going to get it, but it's good.
Soon. Thanks for reading too.
Yeah, no, I'm waiting for part 4. I'm like, come on, man.
I actually have it written. I'm just haven't had time. Yeah.
So I wanted to follow up on something you said earlier, which is that you define community as trust, which is really, really interesting. So I found the Dispatch Labs Telegram channel, and you have roughly 5,700 members, something like that. We're an early project. We're about 1/10 of that. And you're also a growth marketer, which makes me think that you can be tactical too. If community is trust, how do you build a community?
So for us, it's really about focusing on the most important persona who's going to grow our network, grow our application. That's the developer, right? So when you're in a bull market, yes, I think you should make sure your strategy appeals to retail investors because they can give you money. But see, now all the retail investors have left. They're ashamed. Their portfolio's down by what, 70%?
Yeah, my mom's still mad.
Yeah. So for us, we are okay with having a smaller amount of people because it's just a finite number of developers, right? So. And just me personally, when I'm in Telegram, most of the channels, most of the chit chat is around the token incentives and when you're going to do this, can I get a discount? It's like a lot of low-level conversation I actually don't like personally. Telegram is very important, and I think that's one of the best ways to grow your community. But you also have to put it in perspective to what is the end goal of your particular project. Right? If your end goal is to support app developers, right, then you should focus blindly on satisfying that persona, and then everybody else will come. I think one of the
So if it's affordable healthcare for freelancers, you're saying focus on freelancers and start to build out those people who are going to be vocal in your community.
Yeah, and kind of steal this from my CEO Matt. I think the most important metric that's going to become important is transactions per second used. I think we're starting to see it. Maybe it's something that we probably write about in the future, but people are actually going to look and see, okay, is this blockchain really being used, right? Because now the argument is, oh, my blockchain can do 100,000 transactions per second, which probably all of them can do in a perfect environment. But how many of those transactions are actually being used, right? Because when you look at Ethereum as an example, there's so many dApps that are built on top of it that aren't really doing anything, right? Like I actually like CryptoKitties because it's actually being used, So even though it's kind of stupid, but it's being used, So. Have you seen my cats? No, I haven't. I wish I would have bought some.
Yeah, I'll also. So your question was like, how do you, what does trust mean in that? So. Yeah, well, I mean, so that enterprise aspect I was talking about, like that's part of the reason why we have the EEA is so for folks to share best practices so that they begin to feel comfortable with this stuff. And also, there's a big bandwagon effect of seeing that someone else has done a pilot and trusted it enough, and then people feel comfortable with that. But we're now at the point now where we're, ConsenSys has helped build clearance systems for the Monetary Authority of Singapore. We have South African banks trusting, lots of money on this stuff. It's real. I don't care what anyone says about it not working. When people are making real business decisions on this sort of thing, and it's the rails of how they actually operate, that's what matters. And what I would like to see more of is just sharing these architectures, because again, if you have a blockchain and you're the only one on it, like that's completely useless. It's stupid. What the community means is, is sharing why you trust something, actually sharing the security principles, sharing the best practice, sharing the integrations that you used so that you can have folks to actually play with and actually start cooperating with in a new way. Reaching that out, I mean, that's how we're going to get from all these kind of isolated proofs of concepts to stuff that actually matters, the stuff where you really don't actually trust the other person on the network. More live examples of that, I think that's really important, is setting that precedent.
And I would say talk to Rich, because he's actually our community manager. He's the one who manages all of our Telegram, so he's really good tactically. He actually knows all our top members too. So, yeah.
All right, we'll have our last two questions.
Awesome.
Trust is an interesting phenomenon. I was a Wall Street lawyer, did asset securitizations, and my last business was validating the accuracy of loan files as they left the originators and went to the secondary market. And what's really fascinating is how much money people make by not telling the truth. And with financial assets, it's really a challenge. So I've been wrestling with, how do you bring blockchain to financial assets as they move in the secondary market when A, people don't really want to tell the truth, and B, I've been focusing on the bridge to blockchain where you just validate metadata about the asset, but the asset really has to be stored in an oracle, because there's all these big thick files. You've got, a mortgage today is 1,000 pages thick. You can't put 1,000 pages of PDF in the blockchain. So payment systems are one thing. I'm just wondering, have you guys seen when you deal with financial assets that have a little more bulk to them? What are people doing to build community and solve some of the technical issues that you've seen that are successful?
I mean, when you think about people that make money by not telling the truth, one of the points of a distributed ledger is that you have to tell the truth. Like, you can't hide, right? So, well, you can have a consortium blockchain where it's still permissioned, but the consortium of lenders or borrowers or banks that are part of the system, that they have some trust but not perfect trust, right? Because in the system you just described, it's still a consortium, but bank E or F or G might fudge the truth a little bit because they need to make their books balance or whatever. If that consortium of banks use a ledger permissioned, there would be more visibility to each of their audit and compliance departments of what's really going on. Now, when you talk about tokenizing any asset, whether it's securities or, I was on a project with cattle. We thought about tokenizing all the cattle in someone's ranch. You don't say, well, each token is a cow, right? You say each token represents a percent of ownership of the overall, asset. So that percentage ownership asset that you hold on the blockchain, the way you prove you own it is by being in custody of the private key. Right, the custody of the private key says you hold that asset. Now that asset is a thing that you know stuff about, and that your consortium network knows things about. All those things about that asset don't necessarily have to live on chain; they can live off chain. But you still get into this issue of record keeping, right? So if you still have record keeping about a given asset, you still want to have a source of truth about that thing. So, this project with cows I worked on, we were tracking where each cow was and what was fed and things like that. So like these things were still, the data. So when you start to think about data about a thing, that data has to be auditable, like the way that data was captured has to be auditable. And the chain of custody of that data needs to be auditable as well. And so, everyone in that consortium needs to be able to look and say, okay, I have this file, I can check the hash of that file. This is the one we agreed on. I can see the changes in time over that. So you wouldn't necessarily use the same blockchain for the asset, the asset exchanging as you would for the data about an asset, but you probably use something like a blockchain to also track the changes of the data about the asset, if that makes sense.
So there's so the other aspect of this is like no matter what a blockchain says, like you can either believe it or not believe it, right? And then it's not really useful if you don't believe it, right? So part of this is also readjusting the financial system wherever it's possible and appropriate to actually demand certain processes are managed on these systems and to make business decisions off of them, right? Now, there are some cool technological things that have come about as part of this movement that show some promise for transparency and also for privacy on the same token, again, no pun intended. But it's like, so I was watching a presentation by Dan Bonnet, who's, amazing cryptographer from Stanford, showing how you can demonstrate. So like he was just demonstrating a system for proving bank solvency operating on encrypted data. So where each bank would maintain its transactions separately, and you could actually make guarantees about that encrypted data without revealing it to anybody else. So that ability to do like zero knowledge proofs, homomorphic encryption, a lot of these things have existed in the realm of cryptography, but are now slowly becoming more practical and actually applied out of the academic context in real systems so that you can prove things about the authenticity of data or the legality of certain kinds of transfers and demand that from a business process perspective. There's other work around oracles. This ties to that process piece of like, what can you actually prove? So that comes from integrating with legacy systems and making sure that as they pass through that certain things are checkmarked, IoT sort of systems, trusted servers. There's some stuff happening around off-chain computing so that you can initiate a transaction on-chain, come off-chain, incorporate some data, but keep it within a trusted enclave so that none of that's really shared, and make some guarantee back on-chain that this was done correctly. And that might include KYC information that's shared in privacy. A lot of these permission systems I was talking about, like Quorum, allow for private channels of communication that parallel the public chain, so you can actually create an encrypted channel peer-to-peer and share some of this identity information for KYC-related matters. And then also coming back to the real world or the quote real world where this stuff actually, the rubber hits the road on this, there's some work being done to help integrate these kind of fairy tale land, distributed databases that people can believe or not believe, and actually tie them to real legal incentives and disincentives. So I guess you could consider it that, but basically these sorts of database systems that we've been creating and in some cases playing with, in some cases trusting, and actually tying them to real legal systems. So there's a system that ConsenSys created called Open Law that recently announced a partnership with Rocket Lawyer, and it basically is a legal contract template creator where there are stipulations in there that actually explicitly link to the state of a smart contract. So you can say, if something clears on here, this is legally enforceable. And our hope is that the reverse is true, that if some legal proceeding happens or if something is determined in the meat space land, that actually can be passed through a process of like a human oracle back into the blockchain system to prevent certain transactions from happening or enable them. So that's right. Yeah, the goal is to make it so that there's not much for lawyers to do, and then on the limited cases that they do, provide them with enough information so that they can actually make a case that this had finality, this actually did occur, and there's information about the owner. So, last question.
Okay. So I totally forgot what I was going to ask, but I thought I'd touch on the question that this gentleman asked about these projects and establishing trust. Just from my personal experience, so I'm building it's a media sharing platform. We're interested in using an in-app cryptocurrency to help content creators monetize within our platform. So we were exploring our different options. First, we were thinking about launching our own token, but we thought just building our own app coin wouldn't really. We just foresaw a bunch of trouble with that, and then we found this organization called Simple Token. OST is their token, and I heard about him on Jason Calacanis' podcast.
He's invested.
Yeah, and so that was how, like, coming from a trusted source. I think that's something that they've done really well. Is the way they put themselves out there. I've seen kind of categories of projects that are coming at it from this is what we're building, this is who we are side, and then I've seen other projects who are coming at it from like paid ads on CoinMarketCap, and just those have different levels of trust from the introduction. And then the other thing that just added trust is that everything they're saying, it's like they fully backed up. They had their test net ready to launch at the time of token sale. They had a test net ready for app developer, like an API set for app developers to build on. And so they just really just backed up so really like what's garnished our trust and why we're building our application with theirs is one, I mean, we were able to get funding from them. So they had a really strong developer incentive for some companies to be building on their platform, but two, just that like everything they said came true. It came faster than they announced, and over the top. So I'd say that's really how we've trusted them, and that kind of goes along with the scalability. Some of the technology that they're working on, it's a protocol called Mosaic that they're building into it. So right now on their testnet, for our application, we're able to spin up a voting and reward allocation mechanism. It's pretty much just a contract where people are voting on content and then earning rewards for it. And we're able to clock very fast transaction volume. Just with that, we haven't done like a full benchmark yet, but they have astounding transaction throughput, and then also their developer tools are they're incredible. And so for like developers who are interested in trying to deploy the mechanics of a token in a platform designed for consumer application, where their approach is bringing Ethereum to these existing platforms. That's certainly a good project to listen to, and I'd be happy to share what I've known just building on their ecosystem. And so that's me. So didn't mean to shamelessly plug, but I'm happy to lend my insight.
Yep. Thank you for sharing. Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. This was awesome. I'm glad that you all are the committed community that actually showed up. And I appreciate everyone's curiosity on this stuff. You all are ambassadors and curious co-investigators on this stuff. So if you have questions, obviously reach out to us. And thank you for coming out, and please continue supporting each other, educating with each other. And thank you so much to Andy for bringing us together, and for Rocket Space, and for all of us to come over here. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, panelists. That was awesome. So for our next event is 2 weeks from now. All the information is on Eventbrite.